Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get underway. My name is Noel Latif. I'm president of the Foreign Policy Association, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Mary Belknap Distinguished Lecture on U.S. Foreign Policy. Mary was a devoted director of the Foreign Policy Association for over 30 years and a keen student of international affairs. I was pleased to overlap with Mary for close to 16 years, and I know that she would have been delighted that Professor Nye is speaking in her lecture series, and we're delighted that Norton Belknap is here. Norton, welcome. Joseph Nye is University Distinguished Service Professor and former Dean of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He received his bachelor's degree summa cum laude from Princeton University, won a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, and earned a PhD in political science from Harvard. He has served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Chair of the National Intelligence Council, and a Deputy Undersecretary of State. And if you will permit me, I can recall as a lowly intern at the State Department, yes, being included in a meeting at the White House where Professor Nye was holding forth, and you could have dropped a pin. Everybody was listening so intently to him, and I can remember as though it were yesterday, though this is about 35 years ago, that he set out the issues in an extremely clear way, laid out the policy options, and put forth his own recommendation, which was adopted on the spot. So he is the author of numerous books, including famously Soft Power, The Power Game, a Washington novel, The Powers to Lead, The Future of Power, Presidential Leadership and the Creation of the American Era, and his latest book, released this year, is the American Century Over?, which will be available for purchase after his remarks. So it gives me great pleasure to invite Professor Nye to the lecture. Professor Nye.
Thank you very much, Noel. It's a pleasure to be back with the Foreign Policy Association, and a particular honor to speak in a series named for Mary Belknap. So it's a double pleasure. I must say I'm grateful also for your generous introduction. As the saying goes, my father would have enjoyed it, my mother might have believed it. But in any case, it is very nice to be here with you. Let me address the basic question of the evening, which is the American century over, by starting with the question of where did that phrase come from and when did it start? The most famous use of the phrase, the American century, is, of course, the usage by Henry Luce in 1941. And Luce coined the term, the American century, as a slogan to try to get the United States into World War II. And it wasn't very successful. He tried it with an editorial in Time in, I guess, about February of 41, but it wasn't until December 7th, of course, with the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor, that we were able to get into World War II. And in that sense, even Franklin Roosevelt, who was one of the best orators we've had as a president, was unable to persuade the American people to give up isolationism. At one point, Roosevelt turned to his speechwriter, Samuel Roseman, and said, what do you do if you're the leader of a democracy and you look over your shoulder and nobody is following? And so the origin of the term, the American century, was from a period of considerable frustration that the United States wasn't living up to its role. And I think Luce and Roosevelt, but particularly Luce, was concerned that after World War I, the United States had been the most powerful country in the world, but instead of living up to that responsibility, we basically turned inward to isolationism. So I think dating the American century with the end of World War II, when Harry Truman makes the decision that we're going to keep troops in Europe, where they are to this day, and that the United States is going to step in and take the place of Britain when Britain no longer can support Greece and Turkey and the Eastern Mediterranean. That really is the beginning of the American century. So the question I think we want to ask ourselves, if we begin it then, I mean, even though the Americans have been more powerful earlier after World War I, they didn't do anything about it. So if we begin it with 1941, we can ask ourselves the question, what will it look like in 2041 with Luce's 100 years after his famous article? What will be the situation of the United States a quarter century from now? Well, there are a number of people who say that this century, the 21st century, is going to be the Chinese century. You, I'm sure, have heard that many times. And I think also you'll note that there have been, if you look at the public opinion polls, views that the United States is in decline, and that therefore the century for us is largely over. I think that this is a mistake, but let me give you the reasons why. First of all, if you look at this question about decline, it's quite an interesting phenomena in American history that we have worried about being in decline since the beginning. The Puritans who came from England and wanted to escape the Anglican Church and the high church of and worship in their own ways were always fearful that having left the old world behind, that they weren't living up to expectations that they had in this new world. So they worried about decline. And the founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, and others, also worried about decline. They used the model of the Roman Republic, and they said that the United States they feared would go the way of Rome in terms of losing the Republican virtues. But you see it most in the period of the American century, in the period since 45, when you have cycles of American concern about decline. For example, when the Soviet Union put up Sputnik in 1957, that led to a widespread view that the Soviets were passing us, that they were 10 feet tall. If you look in the 1980s, when the Japanese manufacturing processes were apparently so much better than ours, and colleagues wrote books like Japan is Number One or The Coming War with Japan, the view was that Japan was now the preeminent country and that we were in decline. And since 2008, it's been China. The general view has been that the recession, the Great Recession of 2008, indicated that the United States was on the way down. China, which had a massive stimulus package, was experiencing growth at the rate of about 10% a year, and the feeling that this was an indication not of a cyclical turn, but of a long-run trend. So there was a general belief in American decline that has gone through cycles, but got its latest spurt from the recession of 2008. What's interesting, though, is that all these changes in American views about decline tell you more about American psychology than about reality of power in world politics. But it is something interesting psychological that we seem to go through these cycles. In any case, if we think about decline, it's important to distinguish two meanings of the word. One is absolute decline, the other is relative decline. Absolute decline is what happened to ancient Rome, and you will often see editorials or op-eds where somebody say America's like Rome, it's coming to the end of its empire, and so forth. But these are not very good analogies, or I would argue they're a misuse of history. Basically, Rome was not passed by another empire rising. It was suffering internally from an economy which had no productivity and internecine warfare. And the net effect of that was Rome succumbed eventually to hordes of barbarians. It wasn't able to defend itself adequately. And in that sense, Roman decline was absolute decline. There were changes in Rome where things were getting worse and worse. Now, it's worth remembering that it took more than 3 centuries for this to play out, from the peak of Rome's power under Trajan in the 1st century AD to 476 and the final collapse of Western Rome. But, even so, it was a process of absolute decline. The people who want to say, well, that's the model for what's happening in the United States, have to reckon with some points that are historically, factually very different. For example, the United States is an economy which is actually quite productive, and it is demographically one of the few countries in the rich world which is able to keep its position in the world. For example, if you look at the ranking of countries by population today, you'll see that the UN and demographers of the UN rank them as China 1, India 2, the United States 3. 2050, the demographers project, will be India 1, China 2, and the US still 3. Well, that's very interesting because every other developed country or rich country, Europe, Russia, Japan, and so forth, is going to suffer demographic decline and will not hold its place. The reason the United States is exceptional is partly a higher birth rate, but more importantly, it's immigration. As a nation of immigrants able to accept and assimilate immigrants, the United States is going to stay in the rankings that it's had. So demographically, the United States will be strong. In addition to that, if you look at the energy situation, whereas 10 years ago the conventional wisdom was that we were becoming hopelessly dependent upon the Middle East and other sources of energy, and this would sap our strength. Now the International Energy Agency projects that the United States, or North America, I should say, may import no energy in the 2020s. That's an enormous change, a result of the so-called shale revolution, in which the technologies of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing have combined to unleash oil and gas from shale formations, which we didn't think was possible a decade ago. So demography, energy, and I would add to that then research and development into the technologies which are at the cutting edge of this century. Biotechnology, nanotechnology, the next generation of information technology, these are all generally acclaimed as areas where the United States is at the forefront. And behind that is the fact that American universities rank at the head of global higher education. Shanghai Jiao Tong University has done a ranking of the world's universities, and they argue that of the top 20 universities in the world, 15 are from the United States and none from China. And in addition to that, you have the fact that the culture remains entrepreneurial with a rule of law and deep capital markets, which allows the commercialization of many of these technologies. So the argument that the United States is like ancient Rome in absolute decline, I think just doesn't fit the facts. And therefore, these analogies are, I think, mistaken. If you turn to relative decline, it's a little bit more interesting, because relative decline would suggest that the United States' share of the world may go down. And that's more likely. If you look at the 20th century, the United States starts the 20th century with nearly a quarter of the world economy. After World War II, when everybody else is devastated by the war and we're strengthened by it, we become nearly half of the world economy. And then partly as a deliberate policy, through Marshall Plan and other such things, we help others recover. Their share of the world economy increases, so that from 1945 to 1970, there is indeed a decline, relatively, of the United States. Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, who are generally credited as being particularly perspicacious in their views of American foreign policy, actually thought that this decline was a long-term decline. And Kissinger and Nixon talked about a multipolar world in 69 and 70. Of course, it didn't turn out that way. What happened was after we returned to where we were before World War II, our share of the world economy stabilized, and instead of ending with a multipolar world in the beginning of the 21st century, it was a unipolar world. So even Kissinger and Nixon got this wrong. They took a straight line of decline from 45 to 70 and projected it as continuing. Instead, it flattened out. So one has to be very careful not to take straight lines from existing trends and project the future from them. I think the best way of thinking about this issue is you can call it relative decline, or you can call it the rise of the rest, in the sense that what the United States did from 45 to 70 was help others recover. So there was a rise of the rest. It also could be termed relative decline, but it's not one that I think should be confused with absolute decline. In the 21st century, the International Monetary Fund projects that the United States did enter this century with about 22% of the world economy, and they think that in the 2020s we'll probably be down around 18% of the world economy. So some relative decline, not dramatic, but it does raise interesting questions and puzzles, which is if we are less preeminent than we were before, will we be able to take a leadership role and get work done? And that, I think, is a question which we have to take seriously, and I'll come back to at the end. But in any case, when people talk about relative decline, they're not thinking of that general question that I would call the problem of entropy, the inability to get work done. They talk much more about, will China pass us? The one country which has the capacity to surpass the United States is generally assumed to be China. And indeed, some people argue that it already has occurred. A public opinion poll taken by the Pew Charitable Trust a couple of years ago said that a majority of Americans believe that China already had or soon would pass the United States in overall power. Let me give you 3 reasons why I think that's not likely. Power has 3 dimensions. One is economic, another is military, and a third is what I call soft power, the ability to get what you want, not through coercion or payment, but through attraction and persuasion. And in all these 3 dimensions of power, I think the United States will hold its own. Now, you might challenge that first statement about economic power, so let me look at that one first. A year ago, the Financial Times wrote a front-page headline saying that China had already passed the United States in size of its economy. When you look more carefully, you'll notice that this headline quoted economists at the World Bank who were using a calculation called purchasing power parity, which is a good measure of welfare, but not necessarily of power. For example, if you're trying to compare haircuts or housing in 2 countries, purchasing power parity is useful. If you're trying to talk about the cost of importing oil or importing jet engines, that's done at the exchange rate, not in purchasing power parity. And at exchange rates, the United States remains larger the economy remains larger than China. But even if the Chinese do become larger than the United States measured by exchange rates, which they may someday, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be more economically powerful, because another measure of economic power, in addition to overall economic size, is per capita income. And that gives you a better judgment of the sophistication of economy. Having a large economy, being the biggest economy, does give you economic power, but it's not the only source of economic power. Per capita income, as a measure of sophistication of economy, tells you something about what you can do with that size. Let me give you an example. Many of you, I suspect, have something like this in your pocket. This Apple iPhone costs about, $750 in the United States. It's made in China. And so it enters as a Chinese import. But if you ask yourself, how much of the value added is Chinese, it's very small. The components come from Malaysia, Japan, Korea, and so forth. The intellectual property and marketing comes from the United States and is generally assessed as having about 4% or 5% of the value added in China itself. Or, as the Chinese put it, they're better at producing jobs than Steve Jobs. And it's an illustration that when you look at figures of how well China's doing, for example, that China became the largest trading nation in 2009, passing incidentally Germany, not the US, it doesn't tell you something like I just pointed out, which is what's the composition of the trade? What's the value added? How sophisticated is it? So you want to know things other than just total size. Same thing is true with technology. You'll often see numbers that China has now passed the West in the number of patents that are issued to Chinese. And that's impressive. But when you look carefully at the quality of the patents, how many of them are crucial to key industrial processes, not many. I mean, there are a lot of patents, but they're not the ones that are key patents for processes. So this is what I mean by talking about the sophistication of economy, that you can judge by comparing per capita incomes better than you can just by looking at total size of an economy. And in that sense, in per capita income, even if China is larger than the US, let's pick a number by 2030, in per capita income, it won't be richer than the US, probably for another decade or two after that, if then. So there is a big gap there. There's also the question of, will China be larger than the US, and if so, when? One possibility is, which was often projected when China was growing at 10% and we were having negative growth, is that China would be larger than we are and measured in exchange rates by roughly 2019. I think the London Economist had the date down that near to us now. Now most people would say that it's more like 2028, 2030, something like that, because Chinese growth rates have slowed down. Indeed, one economist, Charles Wolfe at the Rand Corporation, thinks it'll be in the 2040s. But at some point, if you have an economy of 1.3 billion and another economy of 350 million, the total size of the Chinese economy will be bigger. But the Chinese economy faces a number of questions. I mean, they now talk about the new normal being 7% growth. That's what Prime Minister Li Keqiang has used. But when you look more carefully at what has happened to other economies that have grown at double-digit rates, such as Japan, which once grew at 10% a year, my colleagues Larry Summers and Lant Pritchett have done an estimate that Chinese growth is more likely to be around 4% in the 20s. In addition to that statistical problem, just by looking at prior countries with high rates of growth, it's worth noting that China faces a number of particular problems. For one thing, a demographic problem. the Chinese labor force is peaking this year. And Chinese are finding that their population composition is going to have more old people and fewer young people. And from an economic point of view, old people absorb resources. Young people tend to, or younger people, working age people, tend to produce them. And that creates a burden for an economy. Similarly, the Chinese call this the problem of getting old before you get rich as a country. A similar problem is the model of economic growth that they've used has relied on export-led growth and using imported technologies. That's beginning to change, but will it change rapidly enough, or will China run into what's sometimes called the middle income trap, where the growth model that got you to middle income doesn't get you out of it to the next spurt? And finally, there's the problem that China faces of politics. We know that when countries reach a per capita income of around $10,000 per head, there's an increase in the demand for participation. And China hasn't yet figured out how to solve that problem of participation. India has it solved because it was bequeathed a democratic constitution by the British at the time of independence. China, with its one-party rule, hasn't figured this out, and it could lead to problems. We don't know for certain, but these are the kinds of problems that mean that just taking China's growth rate, whether you take the 10% number or the new normal of 7%, and extrapolating them with a straight line is probably not going to be accurate. We don't know the future, obviously, but we do know that history is rarely a straight line. In addition to these questions of whether Chinese economic power will be greater than the United States, and I've suggested to you why I don't think so, but if you doubt the numbers and footnotes, you can find them in the book. But in terms of military power, another dimension of hard power, the United States spends about 4 times as much as China. China has been increasing its military budget by over 10% a year, so it's obviously making impressive gains militarily. But in terms of equaling the United States in overall military expenditures, not for quite some time. And what you find is that China will increase its capacity to present a challenge to the United States in the areas off its coasts, in the East China Sea and South China Sea, and that could be and is a cause of some concern. But in terms of a global military presence, the argument that the United States is the only country now capable of projecting military power globally, I suspect that'll still be the case in 2041 when we look at our benchmark for how we're doing on this century. And then finally, let me turn to soft power, which is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. And Hu Jintao, the former Chinese president, told the 17th Chinese Communist Party meeting in 2007 that China needed to invest in its soft power. That was a wise decision, a very smart decision. Because if you're a country whose hard power, economic and military, is increasing rapidly, you're likely to frighten your neighbors into coalitions to protect themselves against you. But if you can combine that hard power with soft power, in which you make yourself look attractive to others, they're less likely to form effective coalitions against you. So China has been spending billions of dollars on things like Confucius Institutes to teach traditional Chinese culture, or things like turning Chinese Central Television or Xinhua News Agency into 24/7 cable channels and so forth. And the interesting question is, how have they done? And the answer is not as well as they'd like. When you look at polls taken by the BBC or by Pew, you'll find that the Americans still outrank the Chinese in soft power in Asia and Europe. Not so much in Africa or the Middle East or Latin America, but particularly in the major countries of Asia and Europe. And why is that? Well, there are 2 problems that China has in expanding its soft power. One is central party control. If you look at American soft power, a lot of it comes from outside of the government. It comes from our universities, our foundations, our institutions, and private institutions, and Hollywood, and so forth. And it's free of censorship. China, the party wants to control civil society, and that limits what their civil society can accomplish in soft power. In addition to that, China has another limit on its ability to develop soft power, and that's the problem of its disputes, territorial disputes with its neighbors. China has a number of claims that it makes on islands in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, as well as a border claim with India. And that means that it's very difficult to develop soft power. If you have just set up a Confucius Institute in Manila, the capital of the Philippines, and to try to make yourself more attractive, but you use your naval ships to chase Philippine fishing boats out of Scarborough Shoal, which is a reef that's claimed by the Philippines and China, the nationalism of the Philippines is going to obviously make China look less attractive, despite the existence of a Confucius Institute. So until China overcomes those limits of tight party control and nationalistic territorial disputes, it's going to be hard for China to beat the United States in terms of soft power, particularly in Asia or where their neighbors are involved. I once, I sat on a board with Lee Kuan Yew, the recently deceased former Prime Minister of Singapore, and I once asked him over a lunch what he thought. Was China going to pass the United States? He gave me an interesting answer. He said, no, they're going to give you a run for your money, but I don't think they're going to pass you. And I said, well, why is that? He said, well, think of it this way. China can draw on the talents of 1.3 billion people, but the United States can draw on the talents of 7 billion people. And what's more, it can recombine them with a diversity which leads to much more creativity than you get under ethnic Han nationalism. This, of course, spoken by an ethnic Han. And I think there's something in that to the extent that that the United States remains open and true to its traditions, it probably will have a capacity to stay ahead of China. Now you could say, why does this matter? Is it, who cares? To boast that you're number one isn't all that important. Well, there are really two reasons why it matters. One is a proposition which you frequently run into, which is that when you have a rising power and it confronts an established power, that can be the cause of great conflict. So the famous Peloponnesian War, in which the Greek city-state system tore itself apart in the 5th century BC, was attributed by Thucydides, its chronicler, to the rise in the power of Athens and the fear it created in Sparta. And many people say that World War I, a century ago last year, that it started, was caused by the rise in the power of Germany and the fear that created in Britain. And so they draw analogies from this and say the rise in the power of China will create fear in the United States, which will lead to a great conflict which will tear this century apart. John Mearsheimer, a distinguished political scientist at the University of Chicago, has come out with a flat proposition that China cannot rise peacefully. I think this is wrong. But one thing that's interesting to note is that in regard to World War I, Germany had already passed Britain in terms of its power, its economic power, by 1900, well before 1914. If you believe what I said this afternoon, supported by what's in the book, then China's not about to pass the United States. And what that means is we don't have to succumb to fear. Now, is the rise of China? Yes. But will it chase at our heels and surpass us so that we become fearful and overreact? No, we don't need to. We, in fact, can manage this relationship. And I think that's important to keep in mind for those who talk about the inevitability of conflict growing out of a rising power confronting an established power. The other reason that it's important is that China doesn't pose an existential threat to us. Nazi Germany, yes, it was a threat to our existence. Stalin's Russia, or Stalin's Soviet Union, the same. But if you look at China today, the Chinese will be a competitor, there'll be a challenge, but basically the Chinese want to get rich. They're not trying to convert us to their version of communism or whatever. And the argument that we can live with China, that we can manage, I think is important, because there are a number of problems which, if we're going to deal with them, are transnational issues where we're going to have to work with China and others. And that takes me back to that point I mentioned earlier about entropy. Can we get work done? And if you look at some of the big problems we face, whether it be climate change, or whether it be financial stability, or whether it be dealing with pandemics, or whether it be dealing with cybercrime, these are things where, in fact, we're going to have to cooperate with others to get things done. And China is going to be a major player. The one area where China has become a world superpower is the production of CO2, where they've passed us. But that shouldn't make us feel good, because in fact, that CO2 is affecting the climate that we inhabit as well as the climate that China inhabits. So being able to work together on these issues is going to be critically important. So the fact that we don't have to fear a war with China if we play our cards well, and the fact that we have useful work to cooperate with China on positive-sum games, I think those are reasons why it's important to get an accurate perception of what the power relationship is between the United States and China, and not succumb to this view that the American century is over, that China is eating our lunch, and so forth. So beware of those polls and editorials which read like the title of a book published in Britain last year by Martin Jock, which the title tells it all. He said, "When China Rules the World." I don't think so. I think the more interesting question for the United States and American foreign policy is the question of whether we're going to be able to get work done, and will we be able to, with a slightly diminished portion of the world economy, will we be able to take the lead in producing global public goods? That, I think, is the greater threat or the greater question for us than China. We're probably good at mobilizing military resources to deal with a particular contender, as those who cite a China threat do. We're less good at always being able to see the larger public interest. For example, the United States has not ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty, even though it's in our interest to do so, as we've seen in testimony by former Republican secretaries of states and chairs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Or to give you another example, in 2010, the United States and other rich countries agreed to slightly increase the emerging market's share of voting quotas at the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. And Congress was refused to pass that, even though it wouldn't cost us much of anything. The net result of that was China started its own Asian infrastructure investment bank. So the danger I see for the United States is not that we're going to succumb to China, and not that, that we're going to have a new war, as some predict. It's that we're not going to pull ourselves together adequately to produce the global public goods. We're going to decay from what sometimes is called American exceptionalism into American exemptionalism, of always giving ourselves an exemption or a pass on some of these issues. So that, to me, is the key question that we ought to be thinking about as we answer the question of my book: is the American century over? And the short form of it is, no, the American century is not over, will not be over by 2041, but it's going to look very different than it did when Henry Luce proclaimed it in 1941, and we're going to have to learn to live with a different meaning of what an American century is. So let me stop there and throw it open for your questions or objections or rebuttals. So, Dan.
Joe, the key phrase.
Here's a microphone here coming. Yeah.
Joe, the key phrase in your comments on China, it seemed to me, were, quote, if we play our cards right.
Mm-hmm.
If we play our cards right. What is your comment on the growing number of observers who fear that, as with the guns of August, we may inadvertently stumble into a situation of shooting war, of mutual devastation, that no one wants and that no one is taking adequate steps to avoid?
Well, I think that's a real concern. What I've tried to say is objectively there's no need for us to do that, but we're human, and humans make mistakes. And so it could happen, yes. And that's why you have to be alert to it. And in 2012, there was a great dispute between China and Japan over what the Japanese call the Senkaku and the Chinese call the Diaoyu Islands. And it's led to Japanese and Chinese ships and planes facing off against each other constantly. And Hillary Clinton then asked 4 former government people, two Republicans and 2 Democrats, Rich Armitage and Steve Hadley on the Republican side and Jim Steinberg and me on the Democratic side, to go and call on the prime ministers of Japan and China, which we did. And the message that we had was threefold. One was to tell them both the same message, that the islands are covered by Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. That's a message of deterrence. Don't make a mistake. The second was improve your communications with each other. You're not communicating well, and you may make mistakes. And the third was think about the impact on the global economy if the second and third largest economies start fighting with each other, which will be bad for you and bad for us. And therefore, the message that the United States gave was our interest is to dampen this conflict. And that message has been both to the Japanese and to the Chinese. So that's an example of the types of things we can do to try to constantly make sure that it doesn't get out of control. But do humans make mistakes? Absolutely. And that's why we have to be continually alert to that kind of problem. Yes?
Yes, keying off of the last question, in the last few days we've been reading about the Chinese islands under construction and the Pentagon looking at military plans to deter their continuing in that direction, and the Chinese today condemning that action. How probable do you think is that that might go down the garden path, or is this just the Pentagon doing what the Pentagon does and having little credibility in the White House?
Well, the South China Sea, where these reefs are being filled with sand to make airstrips and so forth, is quite different from the East China Sea. The East China Sea, where we have an alliance with Japan, we have to be absolutely clear that if there's an alliance, that's a line you don't cross. The South China Sea is different in the sense that there are about 50-odd features. They're not really islands. They're rocks and atolls and reefs and so forth. And they're claimed by about 5 different countries. And these claims, some of them are good and some of them are not good. But the bad claims aren't all Chinese. In other words, if some of the paper-thin claims are all round. And the last thing the United States wants to get into is becoming the sort of the supporter of Vietnam or Philippine claims that aren't very good claims. So in 1995, when I was in the Pentagon, we issued a statement when China started building on an area called Mischief Reef, which is aptly named. We said the United States believes that the South China Sea should be governed by the law of the sea treaty, and we take no position on the sovereignty over the various features within it, but we take a strong position that disputes should be resolved peacefully. And that's been our position, and it still holds. The problem that's come up recently is as the Chinese fill in some of these reefs to make them into islands, it actually doesn't give a reef or a rock a claim on the surrounding seabed under the law of the sea treaty, but it does put facts on the ground, I mean, if their planes are coming in and out regularly. So some people are fearing that after China starts flying planes in and out of these, like Fiery Cross Reef is the one that was on the front page of the New York Times about a month ago, that there will be a de facto change of things on the ground. And I think what the Pentagon was doing in the statement last week was not changing our traditional view, that we're not taking a position on sovereignty. We were reinforcing our view that as you build up an airstrip on one of these things, it's not giving you claim over the seas around it. So the idea was that we would fly planes or sail ships through areas that might otherwise be interpreted as belonging to territorial seas claimed by these new de facto islands. And that's a way to sort of make it clear that we don't accept that. So I don't think it's quite as dangerous as it's more signaling than real danger, I think. It's behind you, and then in front.
Can you see a future conflict with Taiwan?
Well, there is if you asked me about 20 years ago, or even 15 years ago, there was a fair chance of a conflict over the independence of Taiwan. When I, again, back to the time when I was in the Pentagon, the Taiwanese were hinting that they wanted independence. Lee Teng-hui was the president of the time, and followed by Chen Shui-bian. Both of them talked about independence. And that drives the Chinese crazy. And so the Chinese started lobbing missiles off the coast of Taiwan to say, you know, this is dangerous and a possible act of war. The U.S. responded by putting 2 carriers just off the coast of Taiwan, sailing by there, and taking some other naval ships and putting them through the Strait of Taiwan. And that was a signaling, again, back and forth that our position is don't use force and solve the relationship between Taiwan and the mainland through discussions across the 2 sides of the strait. We don't accept that Taiwan will be independent. We do insist that it not be taken over by force. So I think that what you've seen in the evolution of Taiwanese politics since then, and in Chinese politics, is a willingness to be more patient. So Ma Ying-jeou, the current Taiwanese president, has been very careful to make clear that he's not pushing independence. And the Chinese, on their hand, have made clear that they can wait as long as we don't push or support independence. So I think the prospects of a war or battle growing out of the Taiwan Strait or the relationship of Taiwan to China is probably less than it was 15 or 20 years ago. I mean, it doesn't, again, nothing is zero, but that's human history doesn't, you know, everything is possible. We were talking about relative probabilities. They've been going down, not up. A woman in the front.
Do you think our current foreign policy towards China, but also Russia and the Middle East, is conducive to our being and continuing to be the country that can get things done globally?
Well, I think I would distinguish between the 3 examples you gave. I think in terms of East Asia, our so-called rebalancing toward East Asia, sometimes called the pivot, but fortunately they've moved away from that unfortunate phrase, because pivot implies turning away from. And rebalancing meant taking more seriously the fact that East Asia is the most vibrant part of the world economy. I think actually our policy in East Asia is in pretty good shape. The relationship with Japan and the United States is much better than it was 20 years ago. I went to the White House dinner for Prime Minister Abe about 2 weeks ago, and I was amazed at how effusive the tributes on both sides were to this relationship. 20 years ago, there were people who said it's over, the Cold War is over, the relationship's over. So that, and I think what we did with East Asia was follow a policy of integrating China, but then keeping our alliance with Japan as an insurance policy. And by and large, I think that has worked. So I would say on that one, yes, to answer your question. On Europe, I think, and particularly Russia, I think the Russian actions in Ukraine were inexcusable and were a major challenge to the post-1945 norm that you don't use force to steal from your neighbor's territory. And I think, therefore, the sanctions were important. They've already accomplished part of what we wanted, which is not that Putin is going to give back Crimea. I very much doubt that'll happen. But it showed that when you steal neighbor's territory, it's expensive. It's not a freebie. And I think that is correct. On the other hand, the last thing we want is to continually isolate Russia. So I think when John Kerry went to Sochi last weekend to talk to Russia about things where we have a common interest, which are things like Iran, North Korea, the Arctic, and so forth, that was correct. So the problem of Russia is still a problem. I think the sources of the problem are what's happening inside of Russia. And I don't think that it's one that we can solve easily, but I think we can try to set limits to their expansion, but also to realize that we have to do business with them. So I would say that one is also tolerable. The Middle East is the one where I'm going to be more negative. I think the Middle East is going through a period of revolutions, which are probably going to take a generation to work themselves out. So if you draw an analogy, it would be like the French Revolution in 1789. Very few people would have predicted that it would take 25 years before you'd have stability return to Europe in the Congress of Vienna. I think we're in something like that in the Middle East. And what's worth remembering is that when the great powers of Europe tried to intervene in the French Revolution, they made things worse, not better. So I think our job in the Middle East is to try to contain it, to prevent it from spilling over, we're going to have to use a number of instruments, but military occupation is not the solution. That once you occupy a nationalistic country going through revolution, you become part of the problem, not part of the solution. So we're going to have to be patient for a quarter of a century, I think, in terms of the Middle East. And the question is, will we have the sense to have that kind of patience? We need to go be fair to the other side of the room, too.
Thank you very much, first of all, for your very interesting lecture. I have two questions. The first question is, even if China is not going to pass the USA as you have demonstrated, before we could speak of an American century because it by itself could impose its decision in the world, but in the years to come, we not only face the threat of the rising of China, but of several emerging economies like Brazil, South Africa, and India. So could all of these countries mean that the American century is over? And my second question is there's a lot of talk that Africa is going to be the future because it's going to grow demographically and economically in the years to come. So do you think that the American foreign policy should be more focused on Africa because the future might be there?
Well, on the point that I made about the rise of the rest, I think Brazil, Indonesia, India, and others will increase their share of the world economy, and this will reduce the American share somewhat. I don't think any of them are in a position to be challengers to the U.S. But it goes to this point that I made about entropy, about being able to organize work. And I think if the United States maintains its capacity to organize networks and institutions, it won't necessarily mean the end of the American century. And I don't see any alliances between those countries that would be a direct challenge to the U.S. I think on the one, sometimes people say the BRICS are the wave of the future, but if you look at the BRICS, more than half of the total size of the BRICS organization is China. And one of the countries, Russia, doesn't belong there. It's a country in decline. I mean, Russia's got both demographic and economic decline to worry about. So I don't see the BRICS as an alliance which is going to challenge the U.S. On Africa, it's interesting in the sense that the most demographically active part of the world is going to be Africa. India to some extent, but Africa right behind it. And we certainly want to be spending more time thinking about Africa and working with Africa. It's not going to be a challenge in the sense of rising China as a challenge or something. The big problem or question for Africa is, and to some extent this is true for India, as you increase your population, if you don't educate that population, then they're a liability, not an asset. So for example, India today, female literacy is only 65%. So unless you get that female literacy up around 100%, which means educating girls in schools at an early age, these additional people are not adding productive capacity to your economy. Leave aside the social justice question, just thinking of economic capacity. And so the same is true for Africa. I mean, it's going to be absolutely essential that Africa, as it increases its population, adds to their human capacity to work, to be able to do things. Again, not just because of social justice, but because of being able to make them productive workers. So we should be helping Africa to meet that type of challenge. Yes, we'll go back. A woman behind.
Thank you. Your comments were so helpful about China, but they were very exterior in a way. I wondered if you could share with us, for instance, and I'm sure you've done it a lot, if you were taking a trip to China for like a week and you had exposure to so many different levels of people, I wonder what you would get from them, a sense of their openness, are they concerned, intransigent, to share with us what you've picked up on the ground, so to speak?
Well, it's interesting. I do go probably once or twice a year on various what's sometimes called Track 2 dialogues. Brent Scowcroft and I co-chair something called the Aspen Strategy Group, and we have a dialogue with the Central Party School in Beijing. And you say, what, you're dealing with those communists? Yeah, they run the place. So we do get to see them. But I also then teach or give lectures in universities. So I meet people in that setting. And most interesting of all is the Chinese students in the United States. 275,000 Chinese students in the United States. I had 2 come into my office this past Tuesday. I guess it was either Tuesday or Tuesday. And one of them, a very smart young woman, said, I want to go back and I want to help my country, but I don't want to have to say what I'm told to say. She said, my year here at the Kennedy School has been really interesting because people say all sorts of challenging things. And when I go home, it's going to be very difficult for me to say challenging things. What do you recommend? That's a hard one to answer. I mean, my answer to her is keep your open mind, but also keep your head down at the same time. Be prudent in terms of how you make your challenges. But you'll find among Chinese a willingness when you're not speaking behind the little flags on your table in front of you, to have really quite frank conversations. And I think this is what I mean that when I say I don't think the Chinese are an existential threat to us. I think that basically they want many of the same things that we do, and we've got to keep communicating with them so that both of us have a realistic idea of what the other is up to. This woman here, halfway back, and then we'll do the front and then switch to the other side.
Okay. Firstly, I have a question, what you mean by global public goods, but my other question is, what is the price that we as Americans have to pay to be ascendant in this coming century? We have very difficult economic inequality, and we have a decaying infrastructure. Our trains, as we know from the latest accident, but we've had a series of them, we're paying a big price for this.
Well, a global public good, an example of it would be clean air or climate. In other words, it's something that everybody benefits, including us. And the problem with global public goods or international monetary stability, if you don't have monetary stability, it's bad for us, bad for others. That's what the Great Recession was about in 2008. And the general view of global public goods is that because everybody can benefit from them, everybody says, I'll take a free ride. I'll get it anyway. And if the largest country doesn't help to produce it, it doesn't get produced. It's one thing if you're Burundi or Rwanda or a small country or Uganda, and I used to live in Uganda, so I can say things about Uganda. If you're from Uganda and you say, should I make major contributions toward climate change or monetary stability, I can't do much about it. So I might as well pay nothing. I'm going to get the benefits if they're there, and if I don't, there's nothing I can do about it. If you're the size of the United States, if we don't take the lead, nobody else will. And that's why it is important that we do it. Now, is it at the cost of our ability to improve things at home? Not necessarily. If you think about monetary stability at the end of the global financial crisis, in which the American Federal Reserve offering swaps to other countries of dollars played a crucial role of stabilizing the system. That didn't really cost us all that much. It cost us something in the short run, but the real cost to us was our mismanagement of the financial system, which led to the recession in the first place. The cost of helping to organize cleanup, if you want, saved us a lot of money, and eventually, in fact, most of it got paid back from those to whom we gave loans and so forth. So, would it prevent us from dealing with infrastructure? No. I mean, many people say with 0% interest rates that we have now, we should be borrowing money and fixing Amtrak. This is crazy that we say that we can't afford to do it. We can. And in terms of the total cost of our foreign affairs budget, compared and including defense, as a percent of our economy, it's half of what it was during the Cold War. So the trade-off isn't guns versus butter, it's guns versus butter versus taxes. And we don't want to pay taxes. And the net result of that is we trade off guns versus butter. And that's not the only shape of the way to solve the problem. So I think we can indeed take a leadership role without bankrupting ourselves. And we can have a leadership role and fix Amtrak. But that's not always the way it's presented in the American political debates. Why don't we do a question in the front here, and then we'll turn to the other side. So,
Professor Nye, I want to bring you back to the Middle East. I do agree with you that the situation there is a mess. The so-called Arab awakening or uprising, this is going to be a long term. My question is, we are involved in the Middle East. I mean, we've waged 2 wars there. We have been a main broker of the so-called peace process between Israel and the Arabs. We have Arab allies there who depend on us for protection, like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. I noticed there was a summit yesterday, and many heads of states didn't even show up because they are worried that we are abandoning them.
Right.
We are worried about Iran's nuclear threat. We are concerned about the lack of progress in the Arab-Israeli peace negotiations, the Palestinian issue. So my point is, I don't think we can afford to disengage from the Middle East. We are there, and we have to constantly play an important role there to try to bring some sense of stability there. This, in addition, of course, to the serious threat by ISIS now. So.
Well, I agree with you. I was not recommending disengagement from the Middle East. We have a number of interests in the Middle East. There'll still be an energy interest, even when we're not importing directly. We still have an interest in preservation of Israel. We still have an interest in non-proliferation of nuclear weapons in the region. We still have an interest in human rights. So we can't, and we have an interest, as you properly pointed out, in making sure ISIS doesn't spill over out of the region. So we can't ignore the Middle East. What I'm saying is we have to resist the view that if we just use enough military force, we'll solve it. We won't. And that idea that we had in 2003, that if we went into Iraq and turned it into a democracy, we would solve this, that is magical thinking. And what we have to do is realistic thinking and realize that we can't avoid the Middle East, but a policy of containing the problem is different from a policy of trying to solve the problem. And I don't think we're going to be able to solve the problem. I think the solutions are going to work out inside the Middle East. I guess we have, we have time for one more question. Well, I see two eyes. We'll do 1, 2, and that's, so we'll make it short, so we'll both say, yeah.
We have a reception afterwards, so you can ask questions during the reception.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. My question concerns the growing United States sovereign debt. And do you think that that it might be running out of fiscal space and that will influence the global influence of the country?
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part. Put the microphone closer.
Do you think that the country may be running out of fiscal space and that will affect the global influence of the United States?
No, I don't. I think that, in fact, when you look at the United States economy, you'll see that we're not a heavily taxed economy. You compare us to the other members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the so-called Rich Nations Club, our tax burden is not as high as many of the other countries. Doesn't mean that we want to raise it that high, but I'm saying if you ask the issue of, is the economy spending so much on international affairs that it can't do more domestically? The answer is no. In the Cold War, we spent 10% of our GDP on defense and foreign policy. Today, we spend less than 5%. So there is fiscal room if we want to. We don't always want to. We don't want to pay more taxes. We don't see the trade-off that way. But is there fiscal room? There could be if we wanted to, but often we don't want to. Then quickly behind, and that's it.
Sure. I just wanted to maybe look at the bright side of things a little bit with respect to China. It's understandable that Americans feel a little uncomfortable with the rise of China. It's grown very quickly economically, and its military is growing even faster. But I'm very impressed personally by the caliber of Chinese leadership. These are very intelligent, highly disciplined, rational, pragmatic actors who work very efficiently with their economic partners and who are diplomatically very sophisticated. And I think if we're going to have a rival that is also a partner, they may not be a Jeffersonian democracy and won't be in the near future, but we should be thankful that they have such an intelligent government and such a pragmatic government. They're not a wild card. There is a wild card in the region, however, and that's North Korea. Now, we have a nation that's run by a man-child psychopath with his finger on the nuclear trigger. And the question I have for you is, how can we motivate China to help the whole region in neutralizing this wild card?
Well, I tend to agree with your diagnosis. I think we should be pleased that China has raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. That's good for them, it's good for us. But you're right about North Korea. It's a leftover bit of the 1950s. You know, it's a Cold War relic of Stalinism that's still sitting there, and it is dangerous. I mean, Kim Jong-un is dangerous. For a long time, the Chinese view was, we don't want the North Koreans to go nuclear, but we don't want instability on our borders. So they were always, they'd always say the right thing about nuclear weapons, but not do much. And then when you talk to them, and I've been involved in this for 20 years, trying to talk to Chinese officials about this, they'd say, well, we can't really alienate them. They're our ally, and so forth. Recently, I've noticed the Chinese tone toward North Korea is changing. We had a group of South Koreans, Chinese, and American ex-officials meet at Harvard about 6 weeks ago, including a PLA general on the Chinese side. And their attitude toward North Korea was much tougher than it's been in the past. And it's worth noticing that Kim Jong-un has not been invited to Beijing, nor has Xi Jinping gone to Pyongyang. So, but whether there'll be enough change soon enough, that still worries me. But I agree with you where we should be focusing.